Welcome to East Coast Winemaking, the podcast that brings professional winemaking experience from popular wine regions on the East Coast of the United States to wherever you are. I'm your host, John Monier. I'm a Finger Lakes winemaker, and I'm excited to provide easy access to educational and entertaining interviews with other winemakers and industry professionals. In each episode, we'll cover the background and unique perspective of my guest on how they approach the craft of winemaking. I'm excited for the opportunity to learn from seasoned wine pros and hope these interviews can be informative to both colleagues in the industry as well as relative newcomers. Feel free to email questions or comments to eastcoastwinemaking@gmail.com and follow us at East Coast Winemaking on Instagram to be notified when new episodes come out. If you're interested in checking out my wine called John Albert, you can find info on that at johnalbertwine.com. Hello, everybody. Happy podcast listening. Today, I am bringing you a conversation with a professional friend, mentor, and somebody that I look up to and aspire to be something like as a professional winemaker, Paul Brock. Paul is the owner and winemaker, along with his wife Shannon, of Silver Thread Vineyard and Winery, which exists in Lodi, New York, which is on the east side of Seneca Lake. He's also a professor of Viticulture and Enology at the Finger Lakes Community College, which is where I learned winemaking and went to school. I had so much fun talking with Paul. It felt great to be kind of doing this full circle thing, going back to the place where I learned winemaking, to be able to talk professional winemaking with my teacher. I think we talked about a lot of really interesting things. For anybody who's been getting bored of the really nitty gritty wine stuff, the good news is we didn't go too much in depth into his winemaking. We talked a lot about his vineyard practices. He's practicing the style of vineyard management called biointensive viticulture, which was really interesting to learn about. And it seems like a pretty niche way of relating to vineyard work, and I think it's super interesting, and I'm interested to learn more about that in the future just based off this conversation that I had with him. We also talked about some other wine philosophy stuff and low intervention wine and his feelings on a lot of things. I think this conversation went super duper well, and I like Paul a lot, so I just had so much fun recording this. The more that I record these podcasts and have conversations with winemakers, the more I realize how fun and educational this is for me. And I know that was a goal at the beginning, and I just feel so lucky that it's kind of coming to fruition. So anyway, I'll stop this monologue and just let you listen to the conversation that I had with Paul. I hope you enjoy listening to it as much as I enjoyed having it, because I just had a great time. I think that's about the third time that I've said that. So enjoy. Here we go. Paul, thank you so much for taking some time out of your evening to let me ask you all about your life and your winemaking. Thank you for hosting me here at the FLCC Viticulture Center. Since I'm an alum of this place, this education, magnate, or every time I come back here, it makes me feel very happy. So I'm excited to be doing this podcast now, back where I went to school. It feels very full circle.
Happy to be here, John, and you're always welcome here.
Thank you.
It's always wonderful to have graduates back. So,
well, maybe we'll have to do this again.
Sure.
So something I haven't always read my interviewees' qualifications, but I was looking at your website to do some research so I could ask you, thoughtful and pointed questions. And you have a little bit about you and your wife. And I was surprised and impressed. I didn't realize how professional you guys are. So I wrote down your qualifications so there can be no doubt in y'all's knowledge and ability.
I have some qualifications. I don't know what I'm qualified for, but
well, we'll leave that to the people who taste the wine and make the big decisions. So you have a master's in Enology and Viticulture, bachelor's in chemical engineering, WSET level 3,
yes,
wine judge certification from American Wine Society,
all that,
and you're a professor of viticulture and enology here at FLCC, which is why we're sitting in your office.
There we go.
And your wife, equally as impressive.
More impressive.
I wasn't going to say more impressive, but very impressive. Wine director. She was a wine director at the New York Wine and Culinary Center, which now has changed names. It's like
the New York Kitchen.
New York
now.
Kitchen.
Yeah.
It said she worked there for like 10 years.
Not quite 10, at least I'd say 6 years. She was one of the original employees.
That's still impressive. Level 4 WSET and a certified WSET educator.
And that's the diploma for all those keeping track at home. Is level 4 is the diploma.
She might be the only person I know that has level 4.
Yeah, there's a few people kicking around.
I mean, not too many people wear the pin every day. So.
No, she does sometimes. Like if she's going out to do an event, she'll throw it on. I never wear my level 3 pin.
Bachelor's in public policy, master's in school administration, and also has the wine judge certification from American Wine Society.
Yes,
so
indeed.
I don't mean to set the I don't mean to, hopefully it's not an insult in future people that I interview if I don't read all of their qualifications. Yours were just so readily available, and I read through them, and I was like, I've known Paul for a long time, and I had no idea. I was already impressed by who you are professionally. So anyway, now it's on record.
Well, thank you.
The first thing that I'm hoping you will regale us with the tale of how you found yourself interested in wine in general, whether from the beginning that was wine production or I don't know. And then I assume part of that is going to be how your story combines with your wife's story and how you ended up. I should also, now is a good time to add, you are the owner and winemaker of Silver Thread Winery, located in Lodi, New York, right?
Yes.
Which is on the east side of Seneca Lake, more than halfway down. I had to look at it on a map to confirm. But,
yes.
So, yeah, the story of how you ended up where you are now, kind of starting from the very beginning.
Yeah, so it's totally intertwined with my wife. I mean, when I grew up very middle-class background, and wine came out of jugs and bags, right? So it wasn't, I always thought you had to be born into the wine industry, and that's how, like, when I graduated from college, that's really what I thought. But Shannon had a slightly different experience in college. She went to Cornell, and there's this famed hotel wines class that there's like 800 people in every year, and she took that class, and she got into wine, and we were dating in college on and off, and she actually took me to my first winery, which was Wagner Vineyards, which we can see out of our kitchen window.
No kidding.
Now. Yep.
Talk about full circle.
Yep. Yeah, we haven't gone that far.
So just to confirm, you were at Cornell for your master's.
I was.
And she was there for her bachelor's.
Yeah. So I was working as a patent examiner, and she was a teacher in Fairfax, Virginia, and she kind of was into wine and knew something about wine, and I really didn't. And she kind of, it got to the point where the dinner conversations needed to be improved, so I started reading about wine on my way to work, because I took the metro to work every day, so I had like over an hour a day just to like read and absorb information. And I was kind of into it, and eventually we had a conversation, I'd say January of 2001, that we'd come up with a plan. This was before we were married, actually. We'd come up with a plan to end up in the Finger Lakes, or me go to grad school at 5 years, and then we'd save money. I'd go to grad school, and then we would end up in the Finger Lakes. So originally the plan was Davis, because Davis is the shiny, bright object in wine education in the U.S.
No doubt.
And when I went out to Davis to interview there and talk to some professors, they're like, wow, you should really, if you want to make wine in the Finger Lakes, you should probably go to Cornell. And So I looked into Cornell, and literally from, if it wasn't dark out right now, you could see the building that I did my graduate work in here in Geneva. So I was at Cornell. I ended up at Cornell. Well, long story short, kind of skipped the part where we quit our jobs, went to New Zealand, and it was in New Zealand that we decided where I was going to go to grad school, and we picked here. So yeah, out my kitchen window, I can see the first winery I ever went to. Out my office window, I can see where I studied in grad school. So.
It's a small industry.
Yeah, I mean, we saved a bunch of money when we were in DC, and we came here, did grad school, and as a Master's of Science student at Cornell, I got a full stipend, and tuition was paid for, so it was kind of like a job. I actually worked for Morton at Ravines after I graduated. Had a daughter.
It was like an internship.
Finished my thesis and started working for Morton all in the same week. It was awesome.
Oh my god! And I think my life's busy sometimes. I can't imagine.
Yeah. So I mean, that's kind of how I started in the Finger Lakes industry. I was at Cornell for a couple of years with Morton. Brief stint with Cuckoo Lake Vineyards with Mel.
Oh.
And then I was at Lamoureux for a couple of years before I came here, before the opportunity arose here, because there was no professor, no faculty member here at FLCC. There was no program before there was a program for a year before they hired me, but, just kind of in parallel universes. It was, 2001 is when Shannon and I really started looking at, okay, how are we going to go about this wine industry goal that we have? And it was, okay, let's educate ourselves. And we ran into we went to Grey Ghost Winery in Virginia, and they're like, oh, you guys, we were talking to the owners on a tour, and they're like, oh, you should really join American Wine Society, because we were asking them how, we want to get involved. And they're like, check out the American Wine Society. So we did. And, I met Joe Fiola at University of Maryland at our first American Wine Society conference. And Joe's like, hey, why don't you come work for me? You can volunteer. And so I was working for Joe one day a week. I'd drive out to Keedysville in Maryland. And, it was just a great opportunity. We just had all these breaks. You look back at your life and you say, that was a moment that changed the direction of where we were going, mm-hmm. and there's just a lot of those along the way. And, right time, right place. When I had the qualifications to, apply for FLCC and got the job. And then, at the same time period,
when did you start working at FLCC?
So 2010. So
and that was as a professor?
As a professor. I applied early 2010, got the job started in August of 2010. So for that fall, little did I know the responsibility that they were asking me to do. Mm-hmm. Like most faculty members aren't in charge of an entire program or asked to, help design and build a building.
You helped with the design of the building.
I was in every meeting for this building.
Wow.
So there's nothing in the building that didn't get my okay to be here. Wow. There's a few things I was just like, I'll let the architects do whatever they want. But certain things, even the layout of I laid the building out.
To me, that's
handed it to the architects.
One of the most important.
And the thing is, nobody else had any experience with teaching wineries. And I had a little experience, which is more than everybody else combined.
Interesting.
So
did you find yourself going to your wife because of her background in school administration and asking her questions about how you should approach things in your teaching job?
Well, first of all, let me just say she's a better teacher than me. She's a natural born teacher, and that's okay. I mean, both of her parents were teachers. Her grandfather was a superintendent. Most of her aunts and uncles are teachers.
Really? So it's in her blood.
Yeah, there's no teachers in my family. That's not true. I've got a cousin who's a teacher now, but I don't think any of my aunts and uncles were. But I guess I just fell into it and have done it the way I thought it should be done. Because even having a master's degree at Cornell, I didn't really take any wine and viticulture. I took a viticulture class, a couple of them, and I took some sensory analysis class, but they didn't have any wine classes. And I kind of had an idea of how traditional winemaking was taught, and I thought it was kind of not right. So I didn't want to go in that direction. I wanted to teach people how to use modern tools. Let's backtrack a little bit. Modern or winemaking has. You're taking a winemaking class. You're making some wine, John, and at some night, the faculty and staff come in and sabotage you to make it a fault. So you have to fix it, right? So this is how like winemaking has been done, because, you know, really winemaking is just fixing problems, right? You're shaking your head. Yes. No, we don't have to fix problems all the time. Sometimes when we just do things right, it works out.
Oh,
actually,
sure.
Most of the time, if we do things right, it's going to be fine, right? So I always thought, let's teach people how to do things the right way, and then they won't have to fix things as much.
Interesting.
So, I mean, yeah, you know, we teach all the basics, but it's not like if there's we're not teaching people how to fix stuff as much. But anyways, that's I'm off track now. But that's how I got here.
Yeah. Wait, before we go away, because there's one question that you're touching on that if I don't ask you now, I'll forget, which is, do you feel like you teach winemaking the way that you make wine, or is there some intentional discrepancy between the way that you feel it's appropriate for beginners to approach winemaking in the classroom, and maybe it's different from whether it's practices or philosophy or whatever that you feel are appropriate in the winery that you own?
I feel like I'm teaching people how to make wine in the new world modern, using new world modern techniques. So, you know, scientific based approach, data driven, you know, there's got to be a why of why we're doing it this way in the classroom, in the curriculum. There's got to be something I can point to and say, that's why we're doing it this way. And my winery, I mean, let me back up a little bit. As a undergrad, I did chemical engineering. It took me 4 years. I was in, I was out. I really enjoyed the way I learned how to do that stuff, which is really, at RPI, it was a lot of projects. It was a lot of, you know, figuring stuff out. And I've always thought that was the right way to teach people. And as you know, as a student, a lot of it is figure this out, come back, and we'll see if you did it right, without giving you the answer beforehand. So it's always been trying to get people to think about things and not just ask for the answer, because there is no one answer in winemaking.
Sure. So I also feel like that's just thoughtful teaching kind of in general. I mean,
you hope so.
You would think.
Yeah. But I often hear that, oh, Paul must teach people exactly how he makes wine. I'm like, well, no, but I do try and stay up to date, because I do like the idea of, you know, nothing is stagnant, but the winemaking industry, really, we haven't changed how we make wine that much in a few thousand years. You know, but there are new things like just, you know, fermentation. I always point at, like, we should be paying attention to nutrition, and we can pay attention to nutrition. And, you know, even I remember what I didn't learn in grad school, and Morton at Ravines taught me when I worked for him in 2007. That was a very simple thing. It was like, okay to add oxygen to a fermentation. That boggled my mind. And to this day, it still boggles other people's mind. But like, I kind of took that and I saw it elsewhere, and I said, oh my gosh, like, this is the right thing to do, or at least have it as an option. And this is why it's the right thing to do. So when I learned it, I didn't know exactly why it was the right way to do it. But there's a lot more research out there now telling you exactly what's going on when oxygen is added to a fermentation.
Sure.
So, you know, teaching people that as a tool, and then hearing, well, nobody is doing that at their internships. It's like, well, you know, it's not my teaching that's the wrong thing per se, but the people at their internships are hopefully choosing not to do that for a reason, and not just ignoring that it's a tool that they could be using for more successful fermentation. Yeah, that's just an example of something like, yes, I do it. You know, something very specific. I used to always do 2 pump overs during a fermentation, and because I learned that from Morton, and I really embraced that, and that's how I still teach my students to do it, because I do think fundamentally that's the right way to learn modern winemaking.
Interesting.
Because there's of the benefits to the yeast and the population and the ecosystem within the fermentation. But myself, I've gotten away from 2 pump overs for every single fermentation, and we'll always have 1 pump over, and that's the 1/3 sugar depletion to 1/2 sugar depletion. And it always used to be 1/3 or before 1/3, and
Interesting.
I've changed to between 1/3 and 1/2. And there's good scientific research for all of that, and I can't be here all the time for my students, so that they have to make their own decisions when they're here making wine, and and that's their first step of really being in charge of a fermentation, and it usually works out just fine.
Sure.
Right. So they at least get the experience of seeing a fermentation work out just fine using the protocols we give them here. I don't have protocols at Silver Thread. Every fermentation is different. I'm making decisions based on what I think is right. I've got general guidelines in my head, obviously, just like you would, or any other winemaker would. This is how I want things done, and this is why.
Right.
So I think that answers the question.
Yeah,
I am
totally
not,
does.
I don't know, and this, if you, even somebody I've taught, you give two people I've taught and myself the same batch of grapes, or the same, a cut of the same juice, and they're going to make different wines out of it.
No doubt.
Even if they had the same, the same goal in mind, we're going to make a dry Riesling out of this juice. Everybody's dry Riesling will be slightly different, because we're all going to make slightly different decisions. And that's just, the beauty of winemaking, is that there's all these different things that are going to impact that final product. So
yeah, to me, I think if I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of an educate, of specifically a wine production educator. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that philosophically I think would be difficult is that there, up into professional winemaking, there are varied beliefs on what's appropriate and what techniques or tools people choose to use or not use. And so when you're tasked with how do you teach somebody how to make wine right? Well, it almost depends on who you ask.
What is right?
You know what I mean? So, the best, I think, most complete thing that kind of makes sense is to teach people all the tools and be like, you figure it out. You have the info. Now is where you take it and run and determine, maybe philosophically you don't trend in this direction and you prefer that, or whatever. But it seems, in some ways I do envy you, because it seems like a lot of fun, but in other ways I don't, because it seems like there are some hard decisions to be made along the way.
One of my favorite fallbacks when having this conversation is we get a lot of students, and you've seen these people who want to make natural wine, whatever natural, here are my air quotes, whatever that is. Obviously, it probably starts for some native or ambient or whatever you want to call it fermentation. I don't know if they're starting with organic grapes or whatever the hell. Sorry, I don't know if that's, can I say that?
Yeah.
Oh, good.
You can say whatever you want,
kind
as
of
long as you don't
commercial
mind.
or organic grapes that they're starting with. But I always laugh when people want to make a natural wine out of conventionally farmed grapes.
Right.
That being said, I always tell those people who want to make, be the natural winemaker, it's like you have to learn all of the modern conveniences that winemakers have, because we can make a really solid wine every single time. And as you start taking those things away, now you're leaving things up to chance more, and you've got to understand what you're taking away before you just decide you're going to make wine without doing anything.
I totally
just
agree.
Let the juice rot. No, let's not let the juice rot. Well, I mean, we're all letting the juice rot in one way or the other.
Sure.
So this is my romantic winemaking side coming out, which it often does. But
I think it's perfect given the setting. I moderate an online winemaking forum, and on the topic of people wanting to make natural wine, a lot of people come on and say, I've never made wine before and I'm trying to make wine doing no additions, and what's this film growing on the top of my wine and why isn't it wine yet?
It's a lack of additions.
And, the thing that's, I understand that there's a social push for that, but God's honest truth, or at least my opinion, is that winemaking is hard, and there are a lot of things to consider. When I first started working at Ravines and talking with Morten Holgren, one of the first things that he told me was it takes a lifetime to learn how to do it properly, essentially, and that you can always learn new things, which I think is the right mentality to take 100%. Into the winemaking world with you, and that it helps to learn how to make wine what is in some ways the easy way, using all the tools that the world has at your disposal before you start taking ones away, which makes your life a hell of a lot harder. And it's totally possible. I assume, I've never tried, or I've not also had a lot of super stellar natural wine, but philosophically I believe that it's possible to make a really great wine in a low intervention or no intervention way. It's just harder, and so you better have the experience that tells you what smells mean and how to treat certain problems or whatever, back to the problem solving thing again, before you go in that direction. Anyway, we got way off topic.
Well, I do believe you can make a really good low intervention wine, but there's no such thing as a no intervention wine. We've taken the grapes off, we've put them in a container. No grape would ever make its way into a tank, and therefore we have an intervention from the very beginning. But I don't know. I feel that natural wines have gotten a bad rep because people making maybe not great decisions with it, and I don't think that's necessary. I think you can take really good grapes and make a good natural wine out of it repeatedly, but you have to know what you're giving up and what you're embracing, and what the heck is natural anyways. Does that mean we don't feed the fermentation? No, I don't think that is a requirement. We have organic things that you can give a fermentation. Is organic natural? I don't know. Some people would be. So again, it's all about opinion and philosophy.
Totally.
And so having the conversation, it's like you have to lay the barriers of what exactly are we talking about, and then we can have a conversation. But to say it's got to be no intervention, any intervention is wrong, then it's then we can't have that conversation because
what does that even mean?
Yeah, what does that mean?
Defining
let's
terms.
agree what we all are talking about.
It's my philosophy degree coming back. It always used to drive me crazy when people wouldn't define their terms and then have an argument and try and prove a point and be like, nobody knows what you're saying. Anyway,
let's move on.
Between the both of us, I've gotten us totally off track.
I love that.
So I understand properly, as you were telling your story about how you ended up where you are in 2000, by 2001, it sounds like you and your wife already had a plan. Like you were interested in being in the wine game. Did that mean for you hope and planning to own and run a winery?
That was the plan.
Okay. So then you have this going into your time into the Finger Lakes. It sounded like had some cellar gigs. You are, I think where we left off before we got lost in that rabbit hole was you were working at FLCC. It was around 2010.
Yep.
Please take us from there.
Yeah, so August 2010, start here. We're actually in the old Geneva High School. And it was in 2011 that we finally purchased Silver Thread. And we were only able to do that because that 5 years that we spent in DC after it was really 4.5 years, that we knew that this is what we wanted to do. We saved money and we had a very good landlord. Again, it goes back to what points in your life made a big impact? Well, we had this landlord in DC who didn't want to raise our rent. So I think we were paying $850 a month for this bottom floor and most of the basement, front yard, backyard, walking distance to a metro within the Beltway in Arlington, Virginia.
Whoa.
Our neighbors were paying $3,500 for a 3-bedroom condo. We had to drive through driveway. I mean, it was just this guy was a Korean War veteran, Catholic, very religious, and believed in helping people. And he had the ability to help us because he owned the house, because it was probably his first house. It was a 2-family. rental. And he just decided, I'm not going to overcharge young people who are just starting out. So we were able to save a bunch of money.
What a break.
Yeah, it was. And it's not like a bunch of money, but it was more than we had because we had nothing before we started saving.
Sure.
And we, I was always one to have a retirement plan and having, health insurance. And so I was very lucky because, like I mentioned before, I went through RPI for my chemical engineering degree in 4 years in and out. And, I had a professional job by the time I was 22. Well, when I was 22, I started as an engineer. So it wasn't like, I waited to my 30s to settle down and have a career. I kind of started very young with a career, so I had the ability to save money. So I was very lucky in that regard that I made those decisions and was happy with those decisions. It set me up to be able to save money when I got to that point in my life. So by the time I was 30, we quit our jobs down in DC, and started the whole grad school thing.
So say again what year you finally purchased Silver Thread?
2011.
And that winery existed as Silver Thread before you purchased it, as I recall.
Richard Fiegel bought the property in 1977, sold a slice of it to Rob Thomas and Kate Thomas, and that became Shalestone Vineyard. But the part that became Silver Thread, it had an existing Catawba vineyard. It had been continuously farmed since the mid-1800s. We have parts of our property that were abandoned in 1930. The vineyard was abandoned in 1935. So the part of the vineyard that we had was continuously farmed. It was never abandoned in 1935, the upper part of the vineyard. And Richard ripped out the Catawba vineyard that was there in 1977. And by 1981, he planted some vines to be his vineyard. So he acted as his own nursery. And I still have 2 rows of Riesling that he grafted from Riesling that came from Sawmill Creek.
Interesting.
Yep. And so, the site has a tremendous amount of history. It used to be farmed by horses. We find horseshoes randomly. We find old farm equipment in the middle of the woods. We have locust posts in the middle of the woods because the vineyard that was abandoned in 1935 is now woods.
Wow. What's a locust post?
So locust trees make the best posts.
Oh, really?
And yeah, so they don't rot.
Huh.
Imagine a pressure treated post being in the woods after, being, the vineyard not being there for 80 years. It doesn't happen.
Doesn't sound possible, yeah.
No, not possible. But we have locust posts surrounded by fully grown trees with staples in them still.
Wow.
Yeah. So actually with our vineyard, I don't use pressure treated posts anymore. I do still have some because there's still some kicking in the vineyard, but I replace them all with locust posts, and the new vineyard that we've planted in the past couple of years, it's either locust or metal posts. So,
interesting.
Yeah. And I feel very strongly about that because once the post fails, I can cut it up and use it as firewood.
Sure.
It's a very rot resistant wood.
Interesting.
It's black locust.
I don't know why. I think it was just the way locust post sounds like something, a special tool or something like that. I was like, I've never heard of this locust
post.
Is
it's a Marvel
like
super character.
A bird
locust
scare
post.
or something like that. I have on the notes of some of the stuff that I read before I came that on the site 250 years ago, the Iroquois tended peaches.
Yeah, that's what we were told. We weren't there for that though.
I was gonna say, I couldn't believe that when I read it. I was like, peaches.
So peaches came. I guess the Spaniards, the whole missionary, the Catholic missions that they sent across North America, they brought peaches to the Finger Lakes, and the Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee farmed them in the Finger Lakes, in that Hector area.
That's crazy.
And we know they lived there, so yeah.
That's amazing.
Yep.
Just while you were talking about the history of that site, I figured it was a good time to insert this tidbit.
Yep. That's cool.
So you purchased it in 11.
Yeah, we took over on September 1st. We still had all the 2010 wines that Richard made in the cellar.
Oh my God.
we had to figure out a way to bottle all of it. And of course, you can't get a mobile bottling line down to Silver Thread because it's at the bottom of a hill. And so we brought all the wine up to another winery, bottled it there with the mobile bottling line.
Wow.
And that was...
You moved the wine from yours to another winery?
Yeah, I had to filter it.
Whoa.
Rack it, filter
in like a couple
it,
of weeks time. For anybody who can't do the mental math, the reason that's a problem is because the middle or towards the end of September is typically when people are getting their first grapes in. Yep. So to be walking into a winery full of wine at September 1st and still have there be a lot of work to be done with filtering, finishing wine, ordering glass, whatever, to be able to bottle everything and then find a place to put it is a lot of work to do as you're prepping to go into your first harvest at this new place.
Yeah, that was awesome.
It sounds chaotic, but like a fun memory to think back to.
We got the keys on September 1st and, kind of getting my bearings. And of course, the semester was just starting at FLCC. So I had that going on. And I remember at one point looking at Shannon going, I need to clone myself in order to get all this done. I was already basically living at the winery, but I needed somebody to be there doing stuff, something to the wine while I wasn't there. And she said, well, Ian Barry said he'd help us out. I'm like, that might be better than a clone because Ian had so much experience in different places. I called him up and he's like, yeah, no problem. So we left the key under the mat for him. He went in.
Oh my God.
Because I'm like, Ian, I don't even know where to tell you where to find this stuff, but it has to be done and we have to figure out a way to do it. Can you do that? And he's like, absolutely, no problem.
This goes back to the problem solving conversation we were having before we started.
100%.
Kudos to him. This is so funny. I did not expect his name to come up and it's only ringing in my ears because I was just texting him. I have plans to interview with him on Wednesday.
As you should.
So anyway, It's funny that his name is coming up. So.
Ian and I are super close. And that was one of the, people help each other, right? And we're a tight-knit community here in the Finger Lakes.
No doubt.
And it's why we're sitting down,
and
right?
if you're lucky, you have winemaking friends who love to make wine and are excited at the opportunity. Honestly, I think I would have more fun. This might sound bad for my professional prospects in the future, but there's something about the idea of making wine at somebody else's winery that sounds more fun than making wine at the winery that you've been making wine at for years. You know what I mean? Like a little change of scenery, get in there, mix it up a little. Yeah, totally.
Oh, you don't know where that is? Oh, yeah, I'll come over and I'll find something and I'll figure it out.
Yeah. That's so interesting.
It's just, we were even talking about this before we started recording. It's just, can you be in that space given a challenge and figure out a solution? And, for the winemakers amongst us, the answer is yes. And the people that were just learning, that's often what separates the people who are learning or have no experience and the people who have a lot of experience is that we're going to figure out a solution. And it often be seamless and be the most obvious thing. Whether it's a stylistic solution or just let's get the nail on the wall and go home. We can hold that on there at least until tomorrow.
Yeah.
So
sometimes that is the way that it has to be. Mm-hmm. So since you've moved in there, have there been any significant changes that you should tack on to the story of how you ended up where you are?
I mean, Richard Fiegel was an amazing pioneer for his time. We bought the only organic vinifera vineyard in the Finger Lakes at the time. I would say in the Northeast, because nobody else was farming vinifera organically at that point. Now we have Weimer doing it, but nobody at that time. I mean, I think Weimer was experimenting with it, but Richard was doing it, and he had been doing it since the 80s. So it was a very unique opportunity to buy an organic vineyard that had a crop on it. And, so we changed some ways we grew vines, but he was also very, he had a very nice tasting room. He had a red barn that is kind of ancient. But we didn't have
that's the one that you still drive by on the way to your tasting room.
It's very iconic. Yeah. And we didn't have a crush pad. We didn't have a press. We didn't have a spray shed to store stuff that we're doing in the vineyard. We didn't have a place to park our tractor that wasn't outside. So we've crossed all of those things off over time. Obviously we got a crush pad pretty quick. We got a place to park the tractor pretty quick. We got a place to store wine. Yeah, we've added more tasting space, just general improvements. The only climate control that was in the building when we bought it was a wood stove.
Whoa. Talk about working with the elements.
Yeah, there was no water treatment. The county, of course, made us install water treatment for good reason, but did we need it? I don't know. The water was fine for 20 years before we ever bought it. But
sure. What about, I assume, like tank cooling?
Oh yeah, we didn't have any of that, but now that was, I didn't have that in 2011, but I got that for the harvest of 2012. It was just like little things every year, do a little bit more.
Sure.
So yeah, I mean, we didn't start off with a lot. That's probably why we could afford it. But we built on little by little, and I was able to, I used to say winemaking is a series of compromises, because you want to do something a certain way or make a certain style, but like you're limited by the starting materials you have and the materials, the things that you have to mold those grapes into the wine that you want to make. I mean, if the grapes aren't right for the style that you want to make, you're not going to make the style. Or if you try and force it, then it's going to be obvious that it's forced.
Yeah, not right.
So I've always been very much of the belief, don't say I'm going to do something until I know I have the raw material to do it. And, that first year was tough. We cooled our tanks by having old sheets, bed sheets on the side of the tanks, and just running water over them continuously, little trickle of water.
That's
just because
wild.
Some evaporation. I don't remember where I learned that trick from. It was from Morton, because when I worked for Morton in 2007, he didn't have... They got glycol halfway through harvest. So previous to that, we were doing this sheets over some tanks also.
Was that when he was at Shaw?
Yes, that was when he was at Shaw.
Facility?
Yeah, I helped him make the first Argetsinger Riesling.
Wow.
I always have that in my pocket.
I should add that to your list of qualifications.
Yeah, right. But I remember those grapes. I mean, knowing Sam, that was one of the great gifts of working with Morton, was meeting, obviously Sam, but
yeah.
Sam Argetsinger, for those,
right. Yeah, I never met
familiar.
him.
If the people listening are familiar with Ravine's wines and Argetsinger Riesling and Argetsinger Vineyard, then Sam was the original Argetsinger that Morton worked with.
Yeah, something I should mention, probably shouldn't take for granted, is the reason that we're talking about Morton like he's so familiar is because he's my boss. He owns Ravine's where I work, and Paul has a close personal and professional relationship with him. So just to clarify that. Mm-hmm. As you're talking about your vineyard, I read on the website, again, there was a quote that called your vineyard practices biointensive viticulture. Yeah. And I'm wondering, kind of, is there a definition to that, / what does it mean? And I think that these are going to be so distinct questions that maybe they don't make sense to go together, but I'll ask you them both at the same time. How does it compare to something like biodynamic, since it
steals the first
shares
three letters?
A similar, name.
Yeah. So biointensive. Well, first of all, I love to call out names, because none of my ideas are original ideas, right? I mean, maybe some of them are, but they're just taking other people's ideas and putting them together.
Yeah, a lot of the time we're building off people who were smart before us.
Yeah. So I used to do triathlons. I might do triathlons in the future, but when I first got it, I was always a soccer player. I first got into triathlons after I stopped playing soccer, about the same time that I was starting this job and starting Silver Thread. And I would swim at the Y at I'd get there at 5 a.m. and there's this guy who would always show up, and we ended up swimming together. And I don't know, after swimming with him for several months, we're like, hey, what do you do for a living, by the way? And then his name is Mike Biltonen, and at the time he was a manager of Red Jacket Orchards, the farm manager.
Interesting.
And he, probably only did that for a couple of years after I first met him, but he's now a pretty well-known consultant in New York with orchards. He's gotten himself in trouble in vineyard. I shouldn't say in trouble, but he's gotten into the vineyard. People hiring him to help them plan out vineyards. A lot of his work is in the Hudson Valley, but he goes down south. He's very accomplished. He's a very accomplished orchardist, and he will help people farm any way they want to farm. So after him and I got to know each other, we didn't really start working with each other for about 6 or 7 years, but he always was like, hey, maybe we could do this at Silver. What do you think about this? And so he had this very extensive organic perennial crop growing knowledge and also biodynamic crop growing knowledge. And I've never been into the biodynamic diaspora of farming for some reasons I don't necessarily want to get into right now. Maybe you want me to get into, but biodynamic, there's some things I see wrong with it, that it's only 100 years old per se, right?
Interesting.
So farming goes back a lot further than that, and those ideas go back a lot further. Now, give Steiner credit, he maybe is responsible for keeping some of those ideas alive, but I've never wanted to pigeonhole myself with those types of ideas. And why can't we modernize some of them? So I've often felt that while biodynamics has some really good things, and I don't want to get too far into it, I was interested in a more biological way of growing, and I was never that interested in the that I don't want to offend anybody here, but the conventional organic method of farming. So I'd already mentioned I bought an organic vineyard, and it was very much copper and sulfur.
That's my understanding of a lot of organic situations.
Yes, and don't get me wrong, you can pull it off with copper and sulfur, but copper is one of the worst things to put into the soil in high amounts, and traditional conventional organic farming. And I hate to put those two words together, but I do when I'm talking about traditional copper and sulfur farming. It's a really good way to ruin your farm by putting that much copper out there, traditional copper, like copper sulfate. Mm-hmm. So I had this like closed mind to organic farming, because I felt like that was their way of organic farming, was dumping all this copper onto your land. So when I started working with Mike Biltonen, he's like, hey, do you think we can get a group of people together to talk about these things? And I'm like, sure. What should we call each other? And it was, so biointensive, that word comes from a group of home gardeners, based for all practical purposes, I guess, in California. You can actually look them up. They've got a website, but they use that word biointensive, not for viticulture or anything, but just kind of general raising of crops, mostly annual crops. So we kind of stole it from them to kind of define a way of growing, best said, biointensive viticulture, a way of growing grapes, and more looking at biological, using biology for the goals in the vineyard, I guess is the best way to put it. So, what are some of the goals in the vineyard? We want to have a healthy soil, right? So what is it that goal is different than maybe a conventional way of farming grapes? And while conventional farming, what are we doing? We might be having an herbicide-free strip under the vines, so you just see dirt under the vines. And what is the biology like in that? Well, it's not that good. It's very different than what would be there natively, and the herbicides that you're putting down are changing the biology, the ecosystem under the vines. So how do we use biology to farm that section of our vineyard differently? So I don't look at growing grapes as what I do in the vineyard, right? I've got an ecosystem out there. I'm taking care of that. And the byproduct of that vineyard system is getting grapes from it. And they've got to be healthy, clean grapes. So I don't find anything in my vineyard other than poison ivy that I don't want out there. Obviously, there's some insects that I don't want, but they're only a problem if they're at really high levels. Mm-hmm. And I'm very aware of stuff like spotted lanternfly, and of course I struggle with great berry moth every year. So but there's organic, I haven't had a deal with spotted lanternfly, but I'm already looking for a biological solution to that. And oftentimes, most of the time, the biological solutions are also organic. And this is kind of a whole new branch of agriculture that's kind of moved in really fast and furious over the past 10 years is biopesticides. And so 10 years ago, it was 8 years ago that I really started down this path. There wasn't a lot on the market. There were some on the market 25 years ago, but they weren't very strong. They didn't do much. And the formulations of those same ones that were on the market 25 years ago have changed. They've gotten better, and they actually work. And the people at Cornell used to say, we're not going to try these because they don't work. And now they're like, actually, these things work. And so the difference is, when you're using one of these products versus a conventional product, you've got to stay out of the vineyard for usually 24 hours at least, maybe 48 hours. There's a risk to the people who re-enter the vineyard. These biological products, generally you can walk in the vineyard 4 hours after you apply them.
Really? Does that make you feel better as the guy driving the tractor spraying
It makes me
them?
feel better about me or my employee that has to go in, or my kids or tourists that might be around.
Totally.
All of those things. And
spray drift, something like that?
Yeah. It makes me feel better about all of that. So just, how do we, and one thing when you decide that you're going to change from a conventional approach to a more biological approach, you can't think of it as and this is a whole different conversation. You can't think of it as a 1-for-1 substitution. I can't take X chemical out of my conventional program and substitute Y biology in. It's got to be more of a holistic system. So like I said, I don't have a lot of things in my vineyard that I'm like, I don't want that. Do I have stuff growing under my vines? Yeah, I want stuff growing under my vines. Am I very picky? Well, I'd rather have low vigor stuff, but we can manage the vigor a little bit, just like we can manage the vigor of vines. So it's a totally different way of thinking about growing. So we have this, we say we're biointensive. How is that different than biodynamic? To get back to your original question. Well, the only way that they're the same really is that those 3 words, right? And why does biodynamic have a monopoly on those, or those 3 letters?
On bio.
BIO, right? Like they don't, because biology came before them, and so we can use those 3 letters. And we're not trying to pull anything over on anybody. Really, what we're trying to do is intensive biology farming, and that's biointensive, right? So, I don't know. I think it's fine that people get it confused. I'm always quick to point out, and we're not biodynamic, we're biointensive. And do I use some biodynamic things? Yeah, I like to, because I don't think it's all bad, but I'd never tell anybody I'm a biodynamic farmer.
Sure.
I think there's some really good things there. But I'm not totally into it.
Yeah, it seems both are more in a direction of, and the intention is to respect the vines and the ecosystem that they create, but it sounds like there are some key distinctions in the way that you approach the whole problem solving, with, they don't have a lot in common insofar as the practices that you might actually see in the vineyard.
Sure. Yeah. And we've had, it hasn't been a linear transition. When we started out, we had some problems and we had diseases that popped up that we'd never seen before and Cornell had never seen. And so we had to kind of retract on how we do things. So I still use, a little bit of conventional stuff at least through like July, but then I don't want to spray anything that's not through mid-July, I'd say. And then we don't use any conventional materials till the end of the season.
Interesting.
And we're only using a few. So like I can honestly say it's like 93% of the things that we're spraying, 95% of the things that we spray are organic or biologic in nature.
Wow.
On our convention, or not conventional, on our biointensive vineyard. But John, I'm really a strong proponent that you read my credentials. I understand wine. I understand the history of wine, at least the parts of it that I've been exposed to, because there's always more to learn. But I've got some grasp on why it is that we're farming Riesling and Chardonnay and Cabernet Franc and Merlot and Cabernet Sauvignon, and yet there's 10,000 other varieties out there in the world. And I'm not afraid, as we were talking before, of new things. So given the amount of inputs we have in our climate, we are growing grapes in a pretty wet climate, that we have all of these issues that we need all of these other solutions to, that we've been talking about during this biointensive conversation. We have to be open to all of the possible solutions, and that affects the types of wines that we might be making. And if we're looking ahead and saying, well, it's getting harder to keep our grapes free of downy mildew every year, no matter how we farm them, then what's the solution? Well, one of the solutions might be having a vine that is growing grapes that has more resistance to downy mildew. So I'm not afraid. I'll be the first one to come out and say, I started off, it's got to be vinifera, and now I'm kind of like, well, it doesn't have to be vinifera, and we should all be looking at it as what other wine styles are we going to be making out of something that's not vinifera, if that's going to be a better option to reduce the inputs in the vineyard. Because let's be frank, there's a lot of inputs in the vineyard, and if somebody asked me, they would never know by listening to this podcast, but if somebody asked me, like, elevator story, what kind of winemaker are you? I'm going to tell them I'm a Riesling winemaker. But I make red wines, I make rosé, I make Chardonnay, and I make these locally adapted varieties that have genetic resistance. And am I putting a name on them like I'm putting a name on Riesling? No, because I'm a Riesling wine. My Rieslings are just Riesling, but these other wines have a place, and I'm looking at those, and it's a very fluid part of our wines at Silver Thread. Is what is Good Earth White? That's going to have, right now we're growing Cuga White and Aravel. Nobody's ever heard of Aravel. Most people haven't heard of Cuga White. So does it matter what they are? No. I don't know that it does matter. All I can tell people is that it matters because we don't have to grow them as intensively. I can grow them organically with all these biological means. I've got a vineyard that's never had an herbicide sprayed in it.
Wow.
And to me, to be able to say that and show people this is possible and try this wine, and it's, what people tell me, it's delicious and, yummy, and they keep buying it. So I've got to be doing something right in that regard. So we're making Good Earth White, Good Earth Red, and we, I'm not just name dropping Good Earth wines because of that we actually own the trademark to Good Earth wines. Richard Fiegel, who again was the previous owner of Silver Thread, was an organic grower. He had Good Earth White and Good Earth Red before we ever got there. So we just kept using it. We've just moved that brand into what it is today and where we think it should be. And I couldn't buy those grapes before we planted this vineyard, because those grapes grown organically or biointensively didn't exist. And they should, because you can actually do that with those varieties much easier than you can with the vinifera varieties.
Sure. So, what variety or varieties is in Good Earth Red?
I was hoping you would ask that. So we're using Regent, which is a variety, again, have you ever heard of it?
I'm familiar with it. I don't know that I've ever tasted it.
Right, yeah. So when were you a student? You're here in 2016? 17. So you might have actually been one of the students that planted it at the teaching vineyard.
Possible.
Yeah, because we've had it since like 2016, 2017, somewhere in there, maybe in 2015. But and the students planted it, so we have 2 rows there.
Oh, I just came to do a tasting of FLCC wine the other week, and I think I tasted the Regent Rosé.
Sure, yeah. They made a rosé out of it last year here, and so I really, obviously having a really key spot to see stuff like that and go, hey, these wines are pretty good. And oh, by the way, this has genetic resistance to these diseases. And in the teaching vineyard that's being grown pretty conventionally. I don't think they're using herbicides. Actually, I know we're not using herbicides there, but the spray program is pretty conventional, but I knew that it had this disease resistance, and I figured with what I knew about using these biological materials, we could get away with a 100% organic spray program that was not a copper and sulfur based organic program. It had just biology, mostly biology that we're relying on. And hey, we've pulled it off 2 years in a row. 23 wasn't the easiest year. 24 was pretty, I don't want to say 24 was easy. There's no easy growing seasons here, but, we got some nice grapes.
More straightforward than 23.
Yeah. And we got, the vineyard was planted in 22, so I didn't really expect to have anything in 23, but the vines are vigorous enough that we had to crop them in 23.
Interesting.
And then this year they had plenty of crop on them. So,
wow.
And it's Steve Lurch, who is a friend of ours, who has been in the industry since 76 at Cornell as a technician. He's taught more people how to prune grapevines than anybody ever, in the Finger Lakes at least. But he kind of warned me. He's like, Paul, don't get too scared about how much fruit they produce, because they're going to produce a lot of fruit. They're different than vinifera. And
interesting.
It was kind of nice to get a little bit of fruit, because
they're more vigorous.
Yeah, they're definitely more vigorous.
Huh.
Which is not terrible.
How vigorous is the site that you're on?
It's maybe 3 feet of soil on shale.
Oh, yeah.
It really shouldn't be a vigorous site. I mean, Silver Thread is not a vigorous site, but then again, where our vines are, there's been vines there for 150 years.
Right.
So we're trying to do as much as we can with the biointensive management, not to tire that soil out anymore. We do have to replant some of our old vineyard at Silver Thread, because it's 40 plus years old. It owes nobody anything. And it's time to kind of start over and give that little piece of ground a better start.
Interesting.
And now that I've had an experience of actually developing a whole piece of land, I feel better about that being a decision, because nobody really wants to plant a vineyard rip out a vineyard that was planted in 83 or 84.
No, that sounds painful.
But sometimes it's the right thing to do. And I think we've finally come around to, we've got to rip out part of our vineyard and replant it, because it's not productive. And if we're putting all these inputs in, regardless of how much we're getting out of it, then that's not a sustainable way forward.
Sure.
And it's when you realize that there's so many inputs and you need to get something out of it still. And that word sustainability, it's a different meaning of what sustainability is. It's like, I could keep on farming these grapes that are going to give me a little bit of grapes, or farming these vines that are going to give me a little bit of grapes. So it makes a lot more sense to farm the same varieties and get more grapes.
Of course.
And really, it should pay for itself. If we rip them out and plant new vines, it should pay for itself within 5 years, because of the amount of extra grapes that young vines would produce.
Wow.
So, the vines change as they get older, and older vines produce different grapes. But you know what? In 10 years, they'll be old too. Or 14 years, and we'll be there before we know it.
Sure.
So...
as we're speaking about your vineyard and, as an extension, terroir.
Sure. It's a French word.
There were a number of mentions on it in the reading that I was doing on your website. Yep. And I think that certainly my personal interest is in the idea of like terroir driven wines and winemaking.
Yep.
And it seems like it's the same for you in the direction that Silver Thread is going. Mm-hmm. There is a little bit of info that I didn't want to take right off of the website. So I'm hoping you can tell me, like in your words, how do you respect the terroir in both the vineyard and the cellar? I think we've talked about the vineyard a lot. So, whatever you think is appropriate, insofar as specifically, like if the goal is to make these terroir driven wines, I think sometimes to say that to somebody, especially who isn't in the industry or really familiar, it sounds like this really kind of ethereal winemakery, like non-existent baloney, right?
Sounds romantic.
I totally agree. I think that there is, to some people, a lack of romance or an inclination for people to roll their eyes when you tell people, yeah, they're both Riesling, but they're from different vineyards, and that makes them special.
Sure.
So,
but can you taste the difference? And that makes it more special.
You always
when you can.
You can. Which drives
well,
me,
being Finger Lakes winemakers, we can look at each other and say, yeah, of course you can.
But I also, know that I have been tasting the same 3 or 4 vineyards for a decade, and, I'm familiar with them.
Yes,
and,
you are.
In any case, how you go about, like, trying to answer that goal of making terroir-driven wines, what that means to you, that sort of thing.
Well, since we've already mocked all the winemakers, I will just, winemaking is, at its core, the idea of manipulating, right? So for all those natural winemakers out there who want to be non-interventionist, then they've already failed because they're calling themselves a non-interventionist winemaker. If you're a winemaker, that's implying the intervention, right? So that being said, to me, terroir-driven wines is really just getting the heck out of the way.
Interesting.
So people always say, well, do you use the same yeast? Do you do the same that? No, I protect the integrity of the fruit. So a lot of it to me is oxygen management after fermentation and proper sulfur dioxide protocols and making sure you filter and make sure nothing's going to grow in the bottle, and like that wine's been protected from oxygen. The SO2 has been the proper level. You've sterile filtered, put it into a bottle. The rest should be up to whatever it is that you started with. And I think that I've proven to myself that that's true year after year. We've been working with the same vineyards, our own vineyard, the Doyle Fournier vineyard, which is now farmed by my friend Matt Doyle, but was planted by Gold Seal under the direction of Charles Fournier, and it was that block of Riesling that we get from is the oldest commercial block of Riesling on Seneca Lake.
Wow.
Planted in 73.
Whoa.
And some of those vines date back all the way to then.
You're just in passing to sidetrack us a little bit. I have done no research and have no opinion on the age of vines and how they relate to the wine that the grapes make.
Sure.
I've heard people who are super, they have a strong belief that there's absolutely a distinction that older is better and something about roots going down deeper and that sort of thing. And I've also heard tell of people who have done whatever kind of scientific study is required to determine that it really doesn't matter. So just based on your opinion and experience, it seems like you lean in the direction that maybe it does matter.
I wouldn't tell anybody it does or doesn't matter, but what I'll say is that there's a strong body of people of consensus out there that says it does matter.
Interesting.
But what I'll tell you is that I've seen some really amazing wines made from 2-3-year-old vines. Mm-hmm. And I think I've made some really nice wines out of 2-3-year-old vines. I don't think that the age of the vine dictates how good the wine will be.
Sure.
Really, whose hands did that go through?
Yeah, certainly it's possible to ruin wine.
You can ruin grapes really easily. We all know that. Just going back, the third Riesling vineyard I worked with for a long time, which unfortunately we no longer get, was the Gridley Bluff Point Vineyard Riesling. And, I've worked with those exclusively for over a decade at Silver Thread.
Wow.
I've counted before, well over 20, closer to 25 vineyards, Riesling vineyards, making wine for various people or for FLCC or with Morton or wherever. And, if you just do the right things, like the things that I'm teaching my students to do, especially like in their last semester when they're just taking wines from fermentation through bottling, if you just do the things and don't screw it up, then you've got a chance of the wines actually showing off what the vineyard was. And I've really proven to myself over time that whatever you do during fermentation, minus like some really funky things. Like if you let crap grow in your grapes, then the wine will also be crap. But if you, control the fermentation and have a really nice fermentation, generally after that fermentation, if you treat the wine, anaerobically and have the right levels of SO2 and you don't mess it up, it's going to reflect the vineyard. So
your feeling is that the vineyard kind of wants to speak for itself, and like the first thing you said, if you get out of the way, it will do that.
100%. And it's not just the vineyard, because we're in this wonderful, cool climate where every year it has different weather. You're also like that. Those grapes are a summation. Sorry to harken back to my chemical engineering days of lots of calculus of everything those vines have experienced over not just the previous growing season, but growing seasons before that got the vine to that point.
Interesting.
So I, as a winemaker and wine appreciator, I've always, can the winemaker tell the story of how the grapes got there? Or are they trying to impose the story themselves? And to me, I'll take the title winemaker, but I don't like the implications that I'm trying to tell any particular story about me. I'm trying to tell a story about the vineyard, and I didn't plant a lot of that vineyard, and I wasn't farming that land before. And hey, people are going to be here in the Finger Lakes, hopefully farming for long after. So what short story can I tell with every glass of wine that I've had something to do with? So I think, I'm not saying that's the right thing to do. I'm saying that's the way I like to see myself in this greater picture.
Sure.
Right. So if somebody wants to make wines that they have a very heavy hand on, that's okay with me. I understand. I've got friends that work at Gallo and Canandaigua, and, they can't have any, it's got to be the same as it was last year, as it was 5 years ago, as it was 10 years ago.
That sounds so much harder. That sounds like a huge job.
My job is a lot easier than that, because I'm simply getting out of the way where they are firmly in the way and can't let anything around them. So it's a lot harder to make wine that way than it is the way that I make it. And I don't want to, make it sound trivial, but, I feel like it's not, I don't know. I hate to say it's not that hard, but to me, like thinking about it, and I think about it all the time. I think about the vineyard all the time, and I spend more time thinking about the vineyard than I do my winemaking. So that should tell me which one is more challenging. So I always think the vineyard managers get the short end of the stick because they often get paid less than winemakers, but yet if the winemaker does their job right, then they're showing off more what the vineyard manager does.
I think the same thing. I have thought in the past that, nobody hears about vineyard managers. I mean, when there's somebody who, after everybody's drank wine at the club picnic and like they're beaming up to, it's the winemaker for his outrageous skill. But I think most really serious winemakers that I know would maybe totally, if not partially, agree that good wine is grown, and that the person who's doing it has a huge weight on their shoulders and ultimately contributes to the success or not of what the wine is going to be like. And, poor vineyard manager. What's funny is most of the vineyard managers that I know aren't wine people. They're ag people, and they just have a green thumb. And probably most of them don't want the spotlight anyway. So it's really funny that it is the way that it is. But
I count myself lucky to be both a vine grower and a winemaker, though, because like I can easily say, most of my job is done by the time I get the grapes in the cellar. I spend more time every year in the vineyard. I mean, I know that for a fact.
That is something that I am absolutely envious of your position. I know that in my professional experience, I'm lacking most in my experience in the vineyard. At this point, I have basically nothing to do with it, and I feel confident to be able to move forward in my winemaking skills and ability. But the thought of having an opportunity to be both the grape grower and the winemaker, not only do I think it seems like a good educational opportunity, but, I think that style of relationship with the wine is more common in places in Europe, like a Vigneron kind of thing, where one person is typically doing more of that work and there's less of this breakup of duties, I think is all in all a particularly thoughtful way of approaching winemaking. And, you know, you really get to have a hand and do whatever you think is appropriate every step of the way, and you really know the grapes and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah. No, I wouldn't have it any other way. I mean, that was my goal when I decided to get into this industry. So I'm very lucky person on earth to say like, hey, I got here.
Yeah. Sounds like you're nailing it.
We keep riding. So,
on that note, I know we've been talking for a while. I just have a few more questions for you. You have a couple distinct single vineyard Rieslings.
Yep.
Do you, when you get like grapes from this place and grapes from that place and grapes from your estate vineyard, do you treat them all the same way? Or are you making decisions like, if anybody listened to my episode that I did with my friend Taylor Stember, she talks about how she has some riper grapes some year and maybe she does some skin contact, you know, or whatever. Are you making decisions like that?
I treat the grapes based on, you know, my understanding of what, you know, how they got to me. And, you know, I'm, as much as I'm saying I get out of the way, I am, you know, a chemical engineer at heart, right? So I want to see numbers. I want to understand the starting material. So, you know, I might make different decisions based on, you know, if it was a cold year or is it a warm year? What is the chemistry of the grapes like heading into that process? And yeah, we'll do skin contact sometimes, and sometimes we don't. I would never take a single fermentation and bottle that. And especially when I'm talking about Riesling, I have done it with like Gewürztraminer because I only have one fermentation at Gewürztraminer, but with Riesling, I'll have like 15, 16 fermentations and multiple fermentations from every vineyard. And really, I look at the vineyard has a story to tell. If you have a single fermentation that you're taking out of that vineyard, so you take the grapes, you make juice out of them, you ferment them, you're telling one potential story out of those grapes. And so looking at it that way, like, it's a translation of those grapes, right? So every fermentation is a translation of those grapes and making it into wine, and you get different characteristics. So I firmly believe for any one vineyard, you're not doing that vineyard justice if you just have the one fermentation. You need to have multiple things going on so you can get as many different translations of that vineyard and then blending them back together so that, you know, we know that different temperatures do different things and express different parts. So having multiple fermentations, being able to get those different parts out of different fermentations and blend them back together, that's, to me, the right thing to do. And because we are in this variable climate, I don't do the same thing every year. I don't do the same thing to every vineyard because every vineyard is different. You know, even though Silver Thread Riesling is grown less than a quarter mile away from the Doyle Fournier Riesling, you know, the most soil my vines have is like 3.5 feet. The most soil the Doyle vineyard has is like 10 feet. It's
Really?
very different.
Interesting.
And you know when you're in the two vineyards that the vines are different. The viticulture is different because I'm not making all the viticulture decisions for Matt Doyle when he's growing those grapes up there. So really, you know, it's not just site. It's not just, you know, but terroir is a lot about the farming. And I knew that too, especially when I started down the biointensive pathway, just to bring that back into it. When we started farming our grapes differently, they express flavors differently, but yet they're still 100%. You could tell they're from that vineyard. Like there's something about each vineyard that if you let it stick out every year, it's going to be there. And then we can bring you back through a vertical, and in warm years, cold years, the lines are different, but there's, you know, especially when you're comparing it to another vineyard, you can see, this is that vineyard. Yeah, there's a total through line. And I'm happy to say that I've achieved that. And, you know, hopefully we'll continue to. I don't see why I wouldn't. But, you know, it's always, you know, you always start off every year. You get, as a winemaker, you get one chance every year to do it, right? So it's not like other jobs that every day you walk in and like, I'm going to make a new dish today and serve that and see how that goes. And tomorrow I can build off of that. It's like we get the one chance a year, so
I know.
you better make it good.
When I had started planning on making some of my own wine, I had all these great ideas about what I wanted to do, and kind of back to what we were talking about before, I had that lesson learned hard where I was like, I know what kind of Riesling I want to make, and then I got these grapes, and the grapes were not right for the direction that I wanted to go. And not only that, I was looking at them like, despite the fact that I played this through in my mind, I can't tell you how many times.
Yep.
Now I suddenly am feeling like maybe I don't know what to do and what the right call is, because it's much more real now than it was, when I was imagining it.
Yeah.
Which is funny.
There's very few decisions you can be hard and fast set on unless like it's dictated by the equipment that you have.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So.
All right. Well, the last question that I'll ask you just as a little wrapper-upper is, what will you drink for dinner tonight? I know it's late. I haven't had supper, dinner. I assume you haven't either. But whether it's today or on average,
on average,
do you drink wine with dinner? Do you have water with dinner? Or,
if you were to take my average, I'm going to go home and have a cream ale first, a Jenny cream ale.
Okay.
No, I drink a lot of Jenny cream ale. People laugh at me like, you don't drink. I've been drinking Jenny cream ale for 25 years.
I respect it. You're really from around here,
but even before we moved here, when we were down in DC, I started buying it because I knew it was from Rochester. I'm like, this is a local beer from Rochester. And there's a lot of really good local beers from Rochester, but very few of the other local, or from the Finger Lakes area, very few of those I would feel good about drinking half of it and then going, I don't really feel like finishing this and putting it aside. But I can do that with a can of cream ale, right? It's cheaper than water. It's really good too. Anyways, I drink a lot of wine. Shannon and I drink a lot of wine. We tend to drink cool climate wines, and not just our own, but from around the Finger Lakes or from other cool climate wine regions. We drink a lot of Riesling because, again, I consider myself a Riesling winemaker. I want to know what else is out there. I like Riesling a lot as a grape varietal. I like cool climate reds. I'm not a huge fan of warm climate reds. I will drink them if that's the only thing that's there. Sorry, California. It's just different. It's a different style. And so we like to drink wines that are food friendly, that you're not going to get wasted after having 2 glasses. Lower alcohol. And I'm not saying like low alcohol like it's a trend. I mean, when I get grapes, I'm not chaptalizing, because if it's 10.5% alcohol at the end of the day, it's 10.5% alcohol. That's okay to me. That's part of the story. That's part of getting the heck out of the way.
Yeah.
I have no predisposition that wine should be 12.5% alcohol. So
I had some of these other questions written down, because on the website it said like, you don't adjust sugar, acid, tannin.
Yeah. But
after all our discussion about your philosophy, it seemed like you had ostensibly answered it about, talking about getting out of the way. It explains where you are on that and how you got there. Yeah. So,
rarely do you pick up a Pinot Noir and look and see it's 11.5% alcohol, because like most winemakers would say, oh, well, I can fix that.
That's not enough.
Obviously wasn't enough sunlight this year, but I can give it more.
Not to get too much back into a winemaker question, but the thing that I have to ask, because I've talked about this on the podcast before, and it's something that I haven't answered for myself yet, how you feel it, 1.5% or 2% like that affects the balance. I mean, you're not worried that it's going to be flabby or wonky?
Balance is subjective. There's so much about wine perception, and as a winemaker, if I were to say this is the right or that is the wrong, like there's obviously some chemistry issues that you can probably look at as a problem in winemaking, that you can say that's a chemistry issue. Maybe we should fix that. For stability. Really, it's a stability thing, right?
Sure.
Right. So, yeah, I get it. Back in 2021, there was a lot of people dealing with grapes that didn't have higher than 9.5% alcohol. And so you have to make your decisions, right? You have to pick your battles. As a winemaker who has control over the grapes that he makes wine out of, I normally am not put in that place, right? So I feel myself very lucky, again, because I'm a grower and I have very close relationships with the people I buy grapes from. And I get it. Sometimes you have to make the decision that the chemistry is not right for stability, whatever. So that's good, right? So,
like you said, it's a practice in making compromises.
Yes. Yep. So I don't know if that answered the question. I forgot what it was.
Yeah, I think so. I just couldn't let you talk about low alcohol wines and not ask if you
that was about
were ever like concerned about it, you know?
Yeah, no, I mean,
because I have interest in making lower alcohol wines, and some people I talk to, they say it's gonna mess up the balance, you know, like.
Well, that's their opinion. And as a winemaker, I think a lot of being trained to be a winemaker is people telling you your opinion matters. And I think sometimes if you really want to reflect the vineyard and the vintage, you have to back away from that. And that's, to me, a winemaking decision I'm making. I'm not telling anybody else it's the right thing to do. If they're concerned about having a little bit of alcohol to add to the mouthfeel of the wine, that's okay, because that's the wine they're making.
Sure.
Right. So I respect that, and I will drink their wines, and I will probably like them. I'm okay drinking any wine. You know, it's not going to kill me. I'll try anything, and I'll usually enjoy it. You know, again, high alcohol wines bother me because I do like to drink, and if I don't want to get wasted when I'm doing that. So, right. I'm not afraid to say that. I think that there's a place when we're in a cool climate, knowing how to embrace your opportunities.
No doubt.
So,
heard. Okay. Yep. That's wonderful. I think that's a great place to wrap it up. Thank you so much for your time. It was great to reconnect. And this was great. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sean. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you all so much for listening. I'm thrilled you could make it to the end of the podcast. If you have any thoughts on questions you'd like me to ask or comments about your experience, I'd love to hear them. Please don't hesitate to email me at eastcoastwinemaking@gmail.com. Until next time, I hope you all have a wonderful day.